So I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about, first of all, my role at a company called PureTech Ventures, where I'm a partner, and the process at PureTech that led us to creating Node and work and kind of diving into this scholarly publishing community. We're working closely now with Wiley and some other groups, a number of universities and research institutions, and so I just want to talk about how we think about innovation, how we thought about innovation in this arena in particular, and then just a couple of parting thoughts to not give any answers, but maybe just trigger some ideas to get things percolating in the room as we discuss this further. So first let me talk a little bit about PureTech, and then Alice talked about Node, which is one of the companies we started, but I'll zoom out and talk about PureTech first. PureTech, we call ourselves a venture creation company. So we're not a VC, and we're very different than a VC. We're really more like a group of entrepreneurs. And what we do at PureTech is we start companies from scratch, from the ground up, based on typically critical unmet medical needs. And I'll talk about in a second, as we worked in this arena, for the last decade, we realized that the access to knowledge in this space had so many holes in it and so many flaws with it that we saw an opportunity also in kind of sharing of knowledge and accessing of knowledge, and that's how we moved into that space. But first let me talk about kind of the biomedical innovation piece, because I think it is instructive also of innovation in other industries, just as Apple's innovation is instructive. So I lost some slides here. How did that happen? Okay, so at PureTech, our model is we try to start with an unmet need or an opportunity. We start with a big area. So what we don't do is say, here's the technology, now how do we figure out where to put it? We try to really start from the ground up and work our way forward. So what I mean by that is bringing in the constituents and the partners who are going to have the greatest insights and the greatest leverage in this area at the beginning, to help us kind of figure out how to proceed in the area. So, for example, we recently launched an initiative called T1D Innovations at PureTech, and we're working with JDRF to commercialize technologies for the treatment of type 1. Now, we don't even actually know exactly which technologies we're going to be commercializing yet. What we do know is JDRF has tapped in to the broadest community and constituency of folks with type 1, understand the unmet needs, understand all the up-and-coming technologies, approaches, exciting new ideas in the field, and working with them as a founding partner has an incredible kind of accelerating effect in our ability to innovate in this space. And we've done this a number of times with a number of different companies in biopharma, in life sciences, and even in publishing. And what that allows us to do is kind of set the context and the lens through which we're going to view this kind of creative process and this innovation process that we're going through. Sorry. And then what we like to do is kind of bring in the thought leaders in the field, number one. So we try to go out and find the greatest experts in this space. So in that type 1 example that I gave you, we have some of the luminaries in type 1 space from all different angles, immunology, beta cell regeneration, drug delivery, insulin, et cetera. Bringing those people around the table with us to help us kind of think about all the opportunities in this space and define them as clearly as we can. And we also try to bring in folks that think about similar types of problems in orthogonal fields. And the reason that's so important is because you don't want to just be stuck with kind of insular thinking from always the same people who are already thinking about the problems you're thinking about. I think that's actually a useful and important analogy that can also be brought to this arena as well. So we try to bring in kind of people who are thinking about the problem, sideways and orthogonally and from all different angles, so that we can, as clearly as possible, articulate an unmet need or an opportunity before we start thinking about how we're going to address that unmet need or opportunity. So I'll give you another example. We started a company called Gelisys, which is a company developing a product for the treatment of obesity. Now, there are a lot of different approaches to that, and you could just say treating obesity is an unmet need, and no one would, I think, argue with it. Very few people would argue about that with you. But what we did is we said, let's take this further and define the problem in a more actionable way. So we looked at what's effective now in this space. And really, at the time we were starting this company, the only thing that was effective was really interventional bariatric type surgeries. and then who's suffering from this disorder, or this disease, or this condition that we can help. And really, bariatric surgery was limited to several, literally single-digit millions morbidly obese people. But there's hundreds of millions of people who are overweight in all different kind of ranges of the spectrum. So we said, can we develop something that's effective as bariatric surgery and has maybe in a mechanistic way similarities, but rather than being limited to 10 million people, can treat 300 million people? And that was the unmet need we articulated. But that took months to get to that point, working with all these kinds of folks. When we got to that, then we could say, okay, now let's address and develop the innovation that's going to address that need. In this case, we actually developed a super-absorbing polymer that you ingest. It swells to 100 times its volume, confers a feeling of satiety, and actually you eat less. And we have really good now clinical data that we're going to be unveiling next month, actually, on this program. So that's kind of a poster child for the innovation process we use at PureTech. And so Gelesis is just one of the companies we started. That's this little picture here. We've started 10 companies, actually, all based on this kind of initial identifying of the unmet need, and then working with the leading thought leaders in the space and others to develop the approach to address the unmet need or the opportunity. So I put my slides out of order. So I don't want to go through this in gory detail, but I just wanted to give you an example of some of the companies we've started, other examples of some of the companies we've started. I talked about T1D Innovations. I talked about Gelesis. Node is a company we started in the kind of the research information space, which I'll talk about in a second, and a number of other really kind of interesting and exciting companies as well. So just a little bit more on the background of PureTech. I didn't include the people here. It's a group of entrepreneurs, but also our scientific advisory board is led by real world-class luminaries in biopharma and in R&D, in the research arena. So one of our advisors is Bob Langer here in Boston, Bob Horvitz, also at MIT, who's a Nobel Prize winner, Raju Kuchilapati, who's at Harvard, but also co-founder of many very successful startups, and a number of pharmaceutical industry executives as well. And we have a very, very strong network in Boston from which we draw not only our inspiration for the kinds of companies we start, but from which we also draw a lot of our sourcing and technology opportunities. And in addition, we've started companies based on technologies in Japan, Israel, Europe, basically everywhere you can imagine. Now, I'm not going to go through this in gory detail, but I wanted, as the other folks did, I want to talk a little bit about the process we use. And this kind of lays it out very specifically. I just hit some of the highlights. I think what's interesting is, number one, a balance of a shotgun approach and a targeted approach. And what I mean by that is, look at all the opportunities, look what everyone else is already doing, but then also do kind of a directed idea generation. So a little bit at Harvard was gathering ideas from everybody else, right? What can we work on? What can we do? That's a great way to innovate. But another really valuable way to innovate is to get all the people, all the constituents in a room together and push on the problem, probe on it, and pull it apart from every different direction that you can. And that's another way that we tackle this as well. And then, exhaustive diligence process, et cetera. This is much more relevant, I think, in a biotechnology arena than in a kind of a more tech-focused arena. But until this patent troll issue gets resolved, I actually think we have to probably pay more and more attention to intellectual property around technology inventions and business processes in this space as well. And as many of you probably saw, the bill that was coming through Congress to address that just died, and it may or may not come back next year. But until then, at least until then, we all really still have to keep worrying about intellectual property, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a fact and a reality. So let me talk a little bit about nodes. So as you can tell, a lot of the work we've done in the past has really been focused on biomedicine, biopharma. But a lot of the founding partners of some of our companies that I talked about had a recurring need that we observed over and over and over again, which was accessing the right people at the right time. So obviously there are things like LinkedIn that many people use. We found that that's much less prevalent in the scientific community, number one. And number two, it requires a tremendous amount of kind of manual upkeep, updating. And so then the next wave of things that cropped up were kind of social networking type sites for scientists and researchers. And again, those are valuable and they're interesting, but what happens is as soon as you ask someone to show up, log into a website, put in a bunch of data, curate a bunch of things, and keep it updated, your participation rate drops from 100% to maybe 5 or 10%. And we see that externally in the broader scientific community, and we also see it internally inside big companies, who literally, some of the, the Pfizers of the world, the AstraZenecas, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. They can't find each other inside their own company when they want to work on a problem efficiently, or sometimes it takes months. I could tell you some stories of guys like waiting by the printer to see, and then when something gets printed out in a field they care about, figuring out who printed it out so they could go figure out who works down the hall from them. So that's not a practical and productive way to kind of find the right people at the right time within your organization and outside your organization. So that was the opportunity we saw with Node. So what we ended up doing is, to kind of make a long story short, we realized we could automate a lot of the process of capturing and defining researcher and scientific identity. And it's not, we don't think of this as a quantitative value judgment type of approach. We think of this as a qualitative, descriptive type of approach. And the way we do it is we just gather all the data we can find everywhere. Publications, patents, grants, clinical trials, et cetera. Pretty soon we're going to be pulling in many, many other kinds of content. And we can use that, and it's of course not in any way trivial to aggregate all the information and then organize it around groups of entities that are cohesive wholes, right? There are many, many John Smiths in the world. Figuring out that these 50 John Smiths are all different people, and which content belongs to which, and this patent was written by the same person who filed this grant and wrote this publication, is a very difficult process, number one. And then filtering through all that information to derive kind of the most interesting nuggets of what that means about that entity, what their expertise is, what they focus on, et cetera. That's kind of the innovation, and that's what we saw as an opportunity. That's why we put Node together. So what it ends up, that would be funny if this person was here, because this is, I think, a real person. But so if this is you, this is just for a demo. But all of you, many of you or your scientific colleagues probably do exist on our public site, which is live. It's just a simple and elegant way to kind of summarize who you are. So we'll have all your content in one place, and then based on all the content you've worked on, we have a sense of what your expertise is, what you've done, what you've worked on. We live in a hashtag world now, so we're moving this to kind of a hashtag kind of mentality for how to access this information. And so if I wanted to do a deeper dive on any one of these topic areas, now I can go click through on that. This isn't a live demo, but I can click through on that hashtag, find out who all the other experts are in that topic area, what the most interesting and relevant content is that's cropping up in that area, et cetera. And then I can see what else is trending, who this person's co-authors are, what those people have done. So it's kind of like what we've done is organized all this information in kind of a graph, as we call it, of different entities, and exploring the relationships between those entities and the whole ecosystem around each of those entities. And every entity can have an ecosystem. A paper is an entity, a person's an entity, an organization's an entity, a university's an entity. You can really do a nice job of defining that ecosystem and interlinking all the parts of that ecosystem, and then giving people the tools to kind of explore throughout that. So just because Todd's on the panel, I should also say that we're working with Wiley on this to provide tools to academic and scholarly societies around these kinds of things for capturing kind of the ecosystem approach around the membership for scholarly societies. So that's one of the applications of this that I think is very relevant, specifically within this group. And so here's another entity. And again, this is all of this is automatically generated on the fly based on the content and the work that we can pull in from the internet. And we can also, of course, integrate proprietary data sources for individual customers and things like that. Okay, end of my little sales pitch. So that's just a quick summary. I don't want to take it much further than that. I want to leave you with just some thoughts to kind of get the juice is flowing a little bit, specifically for the scholarly publishing industry, which of course is very different from biotech. First of all, I think the innovation process is probably a little different, and we learned a lot in our process of creating Node. I think what's different one of the critical differences in biotech, you can pretty clearly articulate an unmet need. Everyone knows it's an unmet need. The whole world knows it's an unmet need. We just don't know how to solve it yet. It's a little bit different than the tech world in general, and scholarly publishing, I think, in particular, where no one necessarily can tell you. If Steve Jobs waited around for people to tell him what the unmet needs were, we wouldn't have any of these great tools we have today. I mean, my favorite example is, predates that, was the Sony Walkman. No one was sitting there saying, like, I really need a way to put this on my head and carry it around in my pocket, but that was innovation that went beyond just waiting around until someone articulated the unmet need. And I think there's a lot of that. That's a much more important element of innovating in this space than innovating in biopharma, where I can literally say, here's a disease that no one knows how to treat yet. That doesn't get much clearer than that. So defining that opportunity is really, really important, and it's not an easy thing to do. So there's a big element of, kind of seeing a little kind of crack in the armor, digging in there and just kind of exploiting it as hard as you can and figuring out if you really have something. And what I think is interesting, and I think is kind of worth thinking about, and I'm not going to give you the answers to these, is there's a long, illustrious history of content creators who have a very, scarce, very valuable, sometimes totally unique asset, right? Movie producers, book publishers, scholarly publishers, who basically, in many cases rightfully, say, we control this asset, and because we're the only one that has it, we can kind of define how it's going to be accessed. And that's true up until the time when it's all of a sudden not true. And all of these, and there's many, many more examples of this, all of these companies are examples of companies that have violently changed that reality. Some of them by destroying the industry that it used to exist, some of them by extremely cooperatively working with the industry that used to exist. So that doesn't mean things have to, I agree with that. It doesn't mean everything has to change fundamentally, but we pretty clearly know that 10 years from now we're not going to be accessing scholarly content in the same way we are now. I don't think anyone here would debate that. So it's who's creating it, who's distributing it, who's promoting it, and how are they doing that? And then on the consumer side, how are people finding it, accessing it, sharing it, discovering it? I think there's little nuggets of insights from how all of these companies up here are making that process radically better in their own field that we can all start thinking about, brainstorming from. You go just make a grid of in each of these areas, what are the innovations and what are the insights that these different companies derived that they exploited and turned into billion-dollar businesses in many cases. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.